clicker, so if I forget to move a slide and I'm just talking about something like completely different than what's on the slide, just let me know, because I'll forget. And I'm also trying to control it on my computer, so something's going to go wrong at some point, so just let me know. All right, you ready with the timer?
Yes, sir.
All right, so if you've ever heard the term stem cell research thrown around, it was likely in your freshman year bio class, or you heard someone slandering it in the news or out in public. It's because stem cell research is a very complicated field. There are some upsides, like the possibilities of significant medical breakthroughs, but there is also one major ethical downside. But it's not so hard to steer clear of that ethical downside. Today, through this presentation, I'll explore the field of stem cell research as a whole to prove to you its merit and to pinpoint the specific practice that can make it so unethical and controversial. So let's start with a little bit of introductory information. According to the National Cancer Institute, stem cells are unspecialized cells that can take many cellular forms like bone, skin, organ, and muscle tissue cells through genetic manipulation. Because of their ability for cellular diversity, stem cells are intriguing candidates for tissue repair therapies and more complex treatments like for ailments like heart disease or cancer. Stem cells are most abundantly found in human embryos, but they also reside in human skin tissue, fat tissue, and bone marrow. As you can see in the micrograph, embryonic stem cells, or ESCs as I will probably refer to it for the rest of the time, occur in centralized clusters, whereas stem cells in adult tissue do not cluster and are therefore much more difficult to isolate. Because of the abundance and concentration of stem cells in human embryos, it's easier and more efficient for researchers to harvest these stem cells from human embryos. Stem cells are also I'm on the wrong slide, so there was our first one. All right. The benefits of stem cell research include possible treatments for numerous simple and complex medical conditions like we already discussed. And many of these possible therapies have already begun clinical trials in the United States. And two examples right here are Provenge on the left, which is used to treat prostate cancer, and on the right, Kymria, which is used to treat leukemia. And that brings us to the major ethical issue of stem cell research, which contributes to what we would call or what you might already know as a negative public opinion of this research. The harvesting of stem cells from live human embryos results in the death of embryos. And from any perspective, the death of human life, no matter the stage, is worrisome. According to Scripture, particularly in Psalm 139, 13 through 16, David describes the formation of human life in the womb of the mother, adding that God ordains a person's life while that person is but, quote, unformed substance. With Psalm 139, 13 through 16 as a perspective on the sanctity of human life, we can infer that the harvesting of embryonic stem cells from living embryos is unethical because the harvesting results in the death of human. And now that we've covered the issue that makes typical embryonic stem cell research so unethical, let's discuss some background information on the biblical portrayal of the study of medicine, as well as some misconceptions of stem cell research. From a biblical perspective, there's a limited number of verses and passages that directly relate to medicine. Much of what the biblical authors have to say about medicine is simply figurative. Notably in Proverbs 17:22, the author discusses medicine through a metaphor. A joyful heart is good medicine, but a crushed spirit dries up the bones. What is clear is that Solomon, the author, is casting medicine in a positive light, and it might not seem noteworthy, but this verse lays a foundational principle for a society that questions the biblicality of the ever-expanding field of medicine. And that principle is simple, kind of. Accept and encourage ethical medicine, but reject and discourage unethical medicine. Now, it's not It's not really that simple to distinguish between ethical and unethical medicine, but in most cases, a person can do so through adequate research, patience, and trust in medical professionals. Deciding on the ethics of certain medical practices is certainly tasking, but the Lord holds Christians to a high standard, one that requires prudence, patience, and wisdom instead of laziness and jumping to conclusions. And now to the misconceptions of stem cell research as highlighted by the California Institute of Regenerative Medicine. First of all, the harvesting of embryonic stem cells is the major ethical dilemma of stem cell research, and that's what I've highlighted in this presentation so far. Also, we cannot eliminate other forms of we cannot eliminate other forms of ethical stem cell research simply because one unethical practice in another form. Many people, especially politicians nowadays, tend to make hasty generalizations about stem cell research as a whole. They recognize a bad example of this research and jump to label the entire field as unethical or immoral. I assure you, though, there are many ethical forms of stem cell research, which we will get into later. Furthermore, the harvesting of stem cells from live human embryos is not murder. Researchers do not harvest stem cells with the primary intent of ending human life. For this reason, any claims that embryonic stem cell research promotes murder are baseless, and they often invite equally aggressive backlash from people who support the research, as you might expect and have probably seen in the media. We have to be careful with how we speak about the unethicality of embryo death in this case, because logically using exaggerative and accusatory language probably isn't going to convince someone else that our opinion is correct. If we as Christians want to make change for the benefit of ethics in human life, we must be civil. Also, when researchers harvest embryonic stem cells, the source embryos are leftover embryos from medically assisted pregnancy techniques like IVF. Researchers never source embryonic stem cells through abortion. U.S. law and International Society for Stem Cell Research guidelines strictly prohibit these harvesting methods and have detailed severe consequences for people who violate that. And lastly, like I mentioned earlier, researchers prefer to harvest stem cells from living human embryos, one, because of the high concentration of stem cells within the embryo, as well as two, the fact that those stem cells bundle together and are much easier to extract. So researchers are going out of their way to kill an embryo just to get stem cells. There is a major benefit to doing this. The obvious solution to the ethical issue of stem cell research is to just do it ethically. And that brings us to three types of ethical stem cell research that offer the same medical benefits as embryonic stem cell research. None of these techniques inadvertently kill human embryos, thereby overcoming the ethical issue of stem cell research with live human embryos. The first ethical form of stem cell research involves blastoids, which are synthetic models of human embryos, not bona fide human embryos. According to Megan Molteni, a journalist for the medical science news site STAT, researchers at the Institute of Molecular Biotechnology in Vienna, Austria, are responsible for the discovery and creation of these synthetic embryo models. And the process to create these blastoids is pretty complex, as you can see in the diagram up there. First, an enzyme is inserted into a skin cell to modify the DNA. Then the cell grows and replicates in a chemical solution that signals the cell to prepare for embryonic growth. And finally, after about 5 or 6 days, we have a blastoid. Blastoids are not embryos, rather they're just something similar to embryos. First of all, they are not made from sperm and egg. When implanted into a uterus also, as is done during IVF and other assisted pregnancy techniques, the blastoid will not attach, and so it will not allow someone to become pregnant. It is possible one day that researchers could perfect gene editing and create blastoids that do attach to the uterine wall, but there's there's quite a long ways to go, and luckily, blastoid researchers are not seeking to achieve this so-called gene editing perfection, because such a process would emulate human cloning, which has been banned for a while, and it's totally regarded as unethical among the scientific community. Now let's talk about, here we go again. Maybe? Nope. All right, I did have it right. Sorry, guys. All right, now let's talk about what medicine has to gain from blastoid research. The overall benefit of this research is the ability to study cell development under the conditions of pregnancy. More specific benefits that blastoid research can contribute includes care for infertility, more effective contraceptives, fewer human or animal embryos needed for research, and a better medium for IVF. If you didn't already know, IVF is the process by which an embryo is created outside of the human body and then implanted into a woman's uterus so that she can become pregnant. The big issue with IVF is that many embryos will die during the growth period outside of the body, and blastoid research is a very plausible way of determining a chemical growth medium that prevents embryo death in the future. Another form of ethical stem cell research is in fact a form of embryonic stem cell research. The embryos in this case though are non-viable or dead, having died through the process of IVF treatment. So the ethical issue that accompanies typical embryonic stem cell research, like I discussed at the beginning, is not present with this form. According to a Columbia University study, about 37% of embryos that are created for IVF reproduction are non-viable or dead. But many of these non-viable embryos contain at least one viable stem cell. The Columbia University study found that 65% of all non-viable embryos contained at least one viable stem cell after 6 days in the embryonic life stage. And it is currently not common practice to harvest stem cells from non-viable embryos. Instead, they're just thrown out. But this study is the first of its kind in that it's the first to quantify the number of stem cells from non-viable embryos that can be used for research purposes. And the lead researcher, Dr. Svetlana Gavrilov, hopes that this work will inspire researchers around the globe to consider using stem cells from non-viable embryos for research purposes. And since research of stem cells from non-viable embryos falls into the category of embryonic stem cell research, we've already discussed the benefits once or twice at the beginning. Just as a reminder, this type of research provides opportunities to create medicine for diseases like Parkinson's disease, diabetes, certain cancers, heart disease, paralysis, and so many more. So there is a big range of things that stem cell research can be used to treat. One major benefit to this specific type of embryonic stem cell research is that the use of stem cells from dead embryos will minimize the need for stem cells from living human embryos in medical research, even more so than blastoid research. And now on to the final major form of stem cell research, just kind of a broad name for it, regenerative cell research. And to preface, the cells that are used in this type of stem cell research are not technically stem cells, but they're very closely related in function and yield the same benefits as stem cells. As per a study on regenerative medicine by Dr. Eckhard Alt in conjunction with Tulane University and the University of Munich, adipose-derived regenerative cells, abbreviated ADRCs, are already specialized cells. They typically reside in adipose fat tissue, and they serve the purpose of cells that are in adipose fat tissue, just exactly what you would imagine. But these cells can regenerate and become one of many types of differentiated cells, and researchers can isolate these ADRCs quite easily with a scaled-down version of liposuction, a procedure that is a little more preferred to than the standard stem cell removal procedure, which involves an extraction from pelvic bone marrow with a syringe. If ADRCs are taken from the same patient, they are used to treat, meaning that they are autologous. They require no genetic manipulation. An unmodified autologous ADRC is therefore given the lovely mouthful acronym UAADRC, which is probably going to be messing up later because I can't say that and I couldn't say it last night when I was practicing. Newly introduced UAADRCs will incorporate into the host tissue as directed by cell-to-cell communication. So in simple terms, doctors must only relocate these UAADRCs to damaged tissue in order to begin the tissue healing process. The cells themselves will control the genetic implementation. And compared to forms of stem cell-based therapies from embryonic stem cells or blastoids, the ability to refrain from genetic reprogramming by humans is a major benefit to this type of research. Overall, UAADRC treatment is not only less complicated, but it's much less expensive. Likewise, according to Dr. Alt, who I referenced earlier, adipose-derived regenerative cells, quote, appear to be the most promising candidates for repair and regeneration of many tissues, including chronic wounds, soft tissue defects, bone and cartilage defects, non-healing fractures, injured tendons, and neurological conditions. UAADRCs have even been used to create hair loss therapies, as you can see in the picture. Now let's wrap things up. The ever-growing field of stem cell research is pretty exciting, but it is of course necessary to conduct such research in ways that prevent ethical dilemmas and public resentment. And medical researchers want that. By conversing with two professors of medicine, Dr. Chris Peterson from Northwestern University and Dr. Eckhard Alt from Tulane University, I've learned that medical scientists want people not only to understand medical practices, but also agree with their principles. This idea is so important because it supposes that the general public has great power in defining the ethical boundaries of medicine. Christians can cause great influence within the scientific and medical communities by informing people about how to navigate controversies like stem cell research. Christians must offer compromises or solutions to even the most difficult of controversies, because without solutions, non-Christians and Christians alike will default to the choice that yields the most self-benefit. As we all know, at the root of all disputes is pride. Oftentimes vying for the prohibition of something is just not going to work, and compromise is our only feasible option. This logic extends to the stem cell research controversy too. Combative language by some Christian groups has effectively stoked the fire among the scientific community. This is not to say that medical researchers now carry out embryonic stem cell research with the sole intent of spiting Christians. Instead, the climate some Christians have contributed to the societal debate of stem cell research is unlikely to persuade researchers to stop taking stem cells from live human embryos. Patience is necessary, so is tolerance, diligence, and respectful discourse. In order to put out the fire of combativeness, we must first kill the ignorance that assumes societal change can arise through anything other than compromise. And we're done.
Sam, was that your closing statement? Did you craft that sentence?
Yeah.
Say it one over again. That was pretty good.
Mm-hmm.
That's good stuff.
In order to put out the fire of combativeness, we must first kill the ignorance that assumes societal change can arise through anything other than compromise.
That was straight from the paper. That was good.
That's good crafting of sentences. But I defer to my colleague who understands science, because she no doubt has some feedback.
Well, I'm ignorant on the topic, and when you clarified the controversy, and my impression was that all stem cell research was from live embryos. Like, I too was ignorant. So my question is, what is I assume it's universities doing the research?
Yes.
As well as there are probably companies that are eagerly connected, dotted line or whatever.
Right.
What are they doing to promote ethical stem cell research? What's going on?
There's not too much going on right now. Mostly it's these small studies from universities like Tulane or Columbia University with that. Columbia University is where that study from about the dead embryo stem cells was from. So there's not too much going on nationwide or worldwide even, but it's these small studies at big universities like Columbia that have really garnered a lot of attention from medical professionals at different companies around the U.S. that are starting to promote that. So
The other question would be, probably along that line, is it a cost difference? Cost and time of getting the cells, is that the big advantage?
Yeah, so especially with that last one that I talked about, you can very easily remove the regenerative cells from fat tissue, and it's so much less expensive than performing IVF to create embryos and then take stem cells from those.
Presumably from the same person, right? From
Yeah.
the same patient, because then like that was one of the things I Googled was like one of the benefits is you're dealing with the same DNA and all that stuff in it, so there's less variables, fewer variables involved.
It almost sounds too simple to be able to take cells from your own body and just put them somewhere and let it do its own work. So that definitely makes it a much cheaper alternative. I included in my paper IVF treatment costs like $15,000 to $20,000 per patient, so it's nowhere near that. So this is definitely a better alternative cost-wise.
So someone has to get an IVF every time they want to do stem cell research?
No. Stem cell research, they typically use the embryos created from IVF. They don't perform IVF to create more stem cells. It's just like if somebody goes in to have IVF done, they create several different embryos, but there's only one that's implanted, so they have a bunch of leftover ones, and those are the ones that are typically used for stem cell research.
I just have one more question. You said that it's not considered murder in the scientific community. Why is it so unethical?
Why is it so unethical?
Yeah.
Well, it's the idea with the versa I talked about, and we talked about in this class too, that human life begins at the very earliest stage that you might be able to imagine. So as soon as that embryo is created, that's human life. So the unethical thing is using or taking stem cells from that embryo, which will kill it. So that's the unethical portion.
And part of the like this is from the place of ignorance as well, that I think I get what Sam's driving at from his technical side of it. There's been this misconception that embryonic stem cell research is by default unethical, because the only way to get these little stem cells, which this is another thing I would love for you to define in a moment, like what makes a stem cell so special? Like why are we looking for these stem cells? So explain that in just a moment. But these stem cells can do amazing things to help us heal things. And the common assumption has been for a lot of us is the only way to get that is by taking it from an embryo, which ends the life of the embryo, effectively ending the life of a baby. And you heard all of our pro-life arguments in here where it's like, that's murder. So like, and that's what Sam's working towards is like, no, it's actually a lot more, I don't know if complicated, much more complex of a way of going about doing this. That here's all these options. And then for the cultural element of the project, it's like, okay, well, if our conception of the idea is oh, this is by default bad, then we're not going to support it. And all these universities doing research in it, well, okay, fine, we don't care about your support anyways. Whereas when we educate ourselves on it, we can say, okay, we're all for the possibilities here, just so long as there's an ethical way of doing it. Like that's what did I present that right? Like again, from a place of ignorance, it's like, okay, I think I know what you're getting at. So like that's the question that I wanted you to help everybody understand. What's so special about a stem cell? Like we're talking about a cell from a human body, not a skin cell, not a bone cell. What's so special about a stem cell?
A stem cell, it's a little complicated. It can be many types of cells, kind of like the regenerative cells. They are, let's see, trying to think of how that's actually.
I think you said it, like, let me get back to,
Well, the best way for me to describe it is like to talk about the formation of an embryo that grows to become a baby and then a child, and whenever sperm and egg cells fuse and that embryo is created, the first cells that are created are stem cells. And what makes them so interesting is that they have the potential to become every single type of cell that you need to just have regular bodily function. So some of these cells will remain in your body after you're born. They remain there in case of damage to certain tissues. Like a lot of them are found in your blood vessels, so that blood vessels can repair themselves if they're damaged, because of course if your body's not repairing its blood vessels, you're going to die. Did that answer part of it?
yeah, like this yes, that and this definition here where you're talking about a cell that basically, because cells replicate themselves, sorry for being a, see, we're not shying away from getting technical here. These cells are so promising because they haven't, for lack of a better term, made up their mind what type of cell they're going to be yet. And so there's a potential that if you plant this cell in with other bone cells, they're going to replicate more bone cells. If you put them in with burnt skin, it's going to start recreating better skin cell. And so someone with leukemia or some type of blood disorder where they lack certain types of blood cells, presumably we can plant some of these skin cells, and literally, like, it's what Sam was saying earlier, it's almost like that seems too easy, that all we need, I mean, you saw some of the treatment there was like bags of fluid. We basically just need to plug you into this thing, pump a bunch of stem cells into you, and let these cells do what cells do and start making right. I mean, I feel like I'm oversimplifying it, but
That's good. I like it.
that's it, right? And that's what's so promising, where in our Bible class, we're talking about human flourishing. Should Christians be on board? If there's potential, if there's this much potential that's this accessible, should Christians be on board? I think so, so long as there are ethical things that we know we need to navigate. Sorry, I kind of geek out on this stuff. I probably
People
should.
grow like limbs and stuff back, like they do in the movies.
It's not as simple as that, but there are some studies actually that they're trying to do just that. It's possible, but it's very complicated, very expensive.
How do they try to
Go ahead.
So,
No, I don't know.
what is your opinion?
They
I
were
know that
very
currently in the U.S. there's a national embryonic stem cell reserve with over, I think it's 500,000 embryonic stem cells currently on hold, frozen, waiting to be in research. These cells have been proven that they cannot be reimplanted into a uterus to grow up. Is the use of these stored embryonic stem cells that aren't technically human life, but they don't have the potential to keep growing, is that still unethical to use?
This is kind of, I talked about this in my paper. It's kind of a complicated thing to wrap your head around, because it's not a very cut and dry thing that you might expect to find in the Bible or just in common morals. Like you said, those specific embryos will not survive otherwise. They're cryogenically frozen, and that's the only way that they're remaining alive. A woman can't get pregnant with one of those embryos. In one of the studies in my paper, it was the Columbia University study with the regenerative cells, or not regenerative cells, it was the non-viable embryo cells. So this is kind of just going along with that, to test whether or not non-viable frozen embryos could possibly form human life. They tested that with about 20,000 of those embryos, and there was a 0% success rate. So they proved that those embryos cannot produce human life, yet they cannot produce more complex human life than what they already are. So it's just, it's a hard thing to say, because it's just, like I said, it's not cut and dry, but it's almost like a resource at that point.
Mm-hmm.
I hate to commodify human embryos and make it sound like an object, but it's really the only way for me to describe it.
Yeah.
It's like what else is
What can we use it for? IVF comes with this whole other set of ethical dilemmas, ethical problems, because here you have a couple who would love to give birth to a baby, but for whatever medical reason they can't. So IVF can be it can be like quite a scientific miracle for a lot of people to provide that way. But the difficulty is it ends up being the way it was described to me was it works a little too well, because in an effort to try to get one fertilized egg, we end up with several. In order to have the one, we end up with several, and then we have that ethical dilemma where it's like, well, so for instance, some really close friends of ours, they underwent IVF, and at one point in time, they were dealing with 8 viable embryos. And then they got freaked out and came to our pastor because it's like, we can't handle 8 children, and we've been taught that these embryos are life worth valuing, and it's just a really tricky thing. Well, as it turns out, nature, as much as you can call this nature, is like nature ran its course, and they ended up with twins. And it's, it's just like a big breath of fresh air. So it's like we're in that brave new world where science, and by the way, he didn't even touch on cloning. This opens up a whole Pandora's box of the ethical problems of cloning, and this being one of them. What Nathan's referring to, now we got a whole warehouse full of embryos that it's like, well, what do we do now? So no, I don't think you're beyond, like, that's what makes this stuff so tricky. You hear yourself saying stuff like, what can we do with this? And you realize, wow, we gotta be careful with human life, people. Like that's something to be valuable. So again, I just want us to sit in there, like, as technical and as mind bending as a lot of this is, I want us to sit in this because this is something that a Christian conscience, the informed Christian conscience, needs to be applied to these types of issues, to think deeply. All right, what do we do in these situations? It's really important for us to think that. Sophia, you all right over there? Just letting it sink in?
So there's like you can actually clone people? Like that's possible? That's crazy.
So you've learned about this with
Yeah, but like the things from Star Wars or like Spider-Man, why are we trying to?
Oh boy, that's a whole nother conversation. Nathan?
Can I ask 2 more questions? One's for clarification.
Quickly.
Yeah, did I answer your last question?
Yes, okay. So one question is, since embryonic stem cell research, the main emphasis is research and not application of this, they're trying to find new ways to treat things in the future. Two of the three that you mentioned as alternatives only have specific applications, as you mentioned, rather regenerative tissue or I believe it was IVF treatment. The middle one was actually using embryonic stem cell research, but you said only 1 out of this whole bunch could actually be harvested. How much would this slow the rate of this research? Like how much longer is it predicted to take versus what it now is?
Well, that's a good question. So I discussed at the beginning, the reason that researchers like embryonic stem cells so much is that in a live human embryo, there's a big cluster right in the middle of the cell, easy to take. And with these dead embryos, there is typically only 1. So it does slow it down a little bit, but it does not make the process that much more expensive. And like you touched on earlier, that federal warehouse that stores those 500-some thousand dead human embryos, frozen human embryos, it clearly shows that there is a very low success rate with IVF. So there's a lot of byproduct dead embryos that can result from that. So it does make it a little more complicated than typical embryonic stem cell research, but it just takes a little more time.
And the last question, because it's one of the hardest things to overcome when dealing with this problem, is that I believe the figure was close to 70 to 75% of humans see embryonic stem cell research and the collection of it as nothing more than the same theory of organ donation, and there's over 95% of Americans believe that organ donation is an acceptable and right thing to be doing. This obviously is from a non-Christian perspective, but as this is a issue that's pertaining to more than just the Christian mindset, how do you overcome this and say to people, well, we believe this, so let's slow down this this research in order to be ethical, even though the majority disagree with this problem?
That's actually something kind of interesting that I very briefly touched on in the presentation. I focus more on it in my paper. It's more of a recent thing too, where medical professionals are starting to say, okay, yes, we see the link between a human embryo and a baby. We're starting to see how the progression of events that leads from a human embryo becoming what they would consider a baby. They're starting to see how there's a lot of significance. And there was one study I talked about in my paper. It was a panel at Harvard University, and there were a few different professors at that panel, each of different religions, and they all concluded that there is some significance to embryonic life. And so that might not have been something that researchers would have said many years ago, even in like 2015 when I feel like I first learned about this. It wasn't something like common to hear
Right.
that non-Christian professors are seeing the connection between an embryo and a baby.
Yeah.
It's something that's just taking time for people to really understand the science of life.
Yeah, people throw around scientific consensus all over the place, and this is one of those things where happily it's like it's starting to catch up that, yeah, folks are starting to realize and know like the embryo is not just a cell, like it's a distinct living organism. Cool. I don't want to take all of your time. I see some of y'all are already giving your feedback, so that's good. The rest of you go ahead and give some feedback. Thank you, Sam. Another round of applause for Sam, please.